This painting, The Wanderer Above the Mist by Caspar David Friedrich, painted in 1818, is often used to illustrate Romanticism, an individual standing alone before an overpowering nature. There is a sense of communion and connection with nature, a sense of empowerment, but paradoxically, a sense of insignificance in the face of the sublimity of nature, of the universe. This ambivalence is reinforced by the facelessness of the protagonist. Is his expression one of ecstasy or one of despair? Does he feel his individuality or his isolation? These and other issues are what we're going to explore today as we consider what Romanticism is, where it came from, and why it is still so relevant to us today. In our everyday parlance, the word romantic is most associated with love, in particular the intersection of passion and emotion. Romantic love is presented as spiritual as well as physical, the connection of two souls as well as two bodies. The term romanticism is also still used to describe our relationship with the natural world, particularly a sense of awe in front of landscapes particularly untouched by human civilization. Typically, romantic natural features include mountains, oceans, deserts, and other places untamed by humanity. To be a romantic today suggests you're a visionary, someone who sees the world can be made a better place, that change is possible. However, romantic can also be used in a more pejorative or negative sense, to suggest someone who's disconnected from the real world. Indeed, romantic is often used as an antonym for realist. The word romantic derives from the word Roman. Following the end of the Roman Empire, various languages, including Italian, Spanish, and French, evolved from Latin and were consequently known as Romance languages. However, Latin remained the language of written communication, primarily by Christian monks, until the 12th century, when poets and others began to write in their own spoken language, French, Italian, and Spanish. With this shift to the vernacular came a cultural shift from the religious to the secular. The most popular genre being romance, tales of knights and ladies more focused on intensely emotional love than on war, and on love between two human beings rather than between man and God. The literary apotheosis of these tales of romantic love were the Arthurian legends, in particular the narrative of Queen Guinevere's illicit relationship with her husband's closest friend, Sir Lancelot. What might seem to us today fairly unexceptional was a significant revolution in human culture, the celebration of human love over divine love, the presentation of romantic love, giving yourself autonomously to another person as providing a justification for seeking self-fulfillment as an individual. This aesthetic of the intense love of one human being for another was mirrored by a shift in religious worship in the 12th century from a primarily ritualistic experience mediated by a priest in church to a more individual, intimate relationship with God, often taking the form of a mystical experience in the natural world away from human civilization, for example, a forest or a hilltop. This intense and personal religious aesthetic laid the ground for the Protestant Revolution of the 16th century. That revolution, dramatized here by an image of Martin Luther standing alone to face down the combined forces of church and state, helped transform Western society not just theologically, but also culturally, socially, and politically, embedding an image of the autonomous individual that would help shape Romanticism over 200 years later. The same century that saw the Protestant religious revolution also heralded the scientific revolution, predicated again on the individual. Just as Protestants interpreted the biblical scriptures for themselves, scientists would interpret the natural world around them independently and empirically based on their own observations and induction, rather than relying on the authority of others. Thus, like the Protestant Revolution, the scientific revolution, which became known as the Enlightenment, became a forerunner of Romanticism, however one against which Romanticism would ultimately react. The very term Enlightenment suggests a supreme cultural self-confidence in a worldview that was believed to be underpinned by reason. The archetypal rationalist and the greatest scientist of his age, and maybe any era, was Isaac Newton. Note the neoclassical pillars to his right. Order and symmetry were the qualities that characterized Newton's elegant, mechanical explanation of how the universe worked, created by a rational God as if it was a piece of sophisticated clockwork. This was reflected in the neoclassical architecture of the period, for example, so house pictured here. Man very much in control of nature, thanks to his knowledge and reason. The idea of order and control, of bending nature to one's will, had political implications. The neoclassical style was favoured by the autocratic monarchy of Louis XIV of France in the late 17th, early 18th centuries. His gardens at Versailles suggest an ordered, controlled society with nothing allowed to be unpredictable or independent. Everything is in its allotted place. At the apex is the Sun King himself, with his wig, makeup, impractical robes. He is deliberately and emphatically artificial and unnatural. However, during this same period of the late 17th and early 18th century, an aesthetic revolution was taking place that celebrated the wild and the untamed over the civilized and ordered. Building on the work of several writers, the philosopher Edmund Burke wrote his philosophical inquiry into the origin of our ideas of the sublime and beautiful in 1757, in which he explained the sublime as the human experience of our limited human faculties of understanding, encountering the unimaginable infinity of the physical universe, whether crossing the Alps or staring up into a night sky. He argued that the individual responds to the extreme sensations of the sublime by asserting the power of his or her own subjective reason in the face of external objective unreason, just as we are forced to make moral decisions out of the chaos of moral disorder. This sense of the sublime lies at the very heart of Romanticism. It was a reaction against the perceived complacency and arrogance of Enlightenment and Neoclassicism, a sense of something irrational, both in man and in nature, the sense both of our own individuality, but also our own insignificance. Of course, there was a romanticism to science itself in the 18th century, a growing appreciation accompanied by a sense of wonder at the complexity of the natural world. This 1768 painting by Joseph Wright of Derby, called Experiment on a Bird in the Air Pump, is fascinating not only for its extraordinary use of light, but the emotion on the faces of those involved. Is it excitement at the discovery or concern at the fate of the bird in the air pump? Is the painting showing human humility in the face of scientific discovery, or arrogance in sacrificing the bird and disregarding its suffering? Is this a celebration or condemnation of the Age of Enlightenment? Romanticism remained ambivalent in its relationship with the rationalist age that preceded it and gave birth to it. Science led to technology, and the Industrial Revolution was possibly the most transformative event in human history, and it began in England in the late 18th century, affecting millions of lives and making much of the landscape unrecognisable. In this painting, Coalbrookdale at Night, from 1801, we see the dark satanic mills described by the poet William Blake. The industrial landscape presented as hellish, but also awe-inspiring, a dark parody of the sublime. This transformation of the natural landscape was another factor that helped influence Romanticism, creating a sense for the first time in human history of the natural environment as vulnerable and fragile. Another source of upheaval and anxiety in the second half of the 18th century was political revolution, particularly the American and French revolutions. The French Revolution had a dramatic effect on the politics, culture, and literature of the time. It was initially underpinned by neoclassical rational values, that monarchy should be accountable, there should be legal social contracts between the ruler and the ruled, instead of the autocratic monarchy. However, The revolution soon turned violent. Its initial leaders were unable to control the social and political forces they had unleashed. Louis XIV's grandson, Louis XVI, his wife Marie Antoinette, and thousands of others were executed. In these macabre images, the heads of the decapitated king and aristocrats are still wearing wigs that represent the rational, ordered society that has now been destroyed by the irrational chaos that lay just below the surface, repressed and ignored by the enlightened elite. During the revolution, one of the prisoners was the Marquis de Sade, who had been imprisoned for his scandalous works exploring the way in which humans were driven by the irrational rather than the rational, by violence and sexuality more than logic and reason. A belief that the Age of Enlightenment, in its mechanistic view of nature and human nature, was ignoring the irrational side of both, helped to shape Gothic literature and art in the late 18th century. Fascinated by superstition, mystery, dreams, desires, fears, madness, suffering, and death. Here, Henry Fuseli's painting Nightmare presents an archetypally Gothic scene, suggesting our dreams, our subconscious, as low-key of both our fears and our desires. As we've seen, the roots of Romanticism went back over many centuries. But if a single place and time can be selected for the birth of Romanticism as a literary movement, it was England in 1798, with the publication of a slim book called simply Lyrical Ballads, written by William Wordsworth on the left and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. As important and influential as the poems themselves was the preface, which announced a radical intent: to choose incidents and situations from common life and to relate or describe them in a selection of language really used by men and at the same time. This focus on language of ordinary people is important. These poets seek not sophisticated diction, artificial diction, but honest, ordinary diction spoken by real people in real life. Although as poets they must throw over them a certain colouring of imagination, whereby ordinary things should be presented to the mind in an unusual way, it is important to make these instances and situations interesting by tracing in them truly the primary laws of our nature. Rustic life was generally chosen because in that condition the essential passions of the heart are less under restraint and speak a plainer and more emphatic language, because from their rank in society and the sameness and narrow circle of their intercourse being less under the influence of social vanity, all good poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. One reason for focusing on the natural world and the people who live in natural surroundings is they are less civilized, therefore less concerned about appearance and status, less deceptive, less masked than the writers of the sophisticated literary world of the city. The lyrical ballads, with its celebration of ordinary people over the powerful and wealthy as a worthy subject for literature, is radical politically as well as culturally. Note here both poets presented a serious and intense, even agonizing in Wordsworth's case, over the words he's writing. They seek to communicate authentic feelings in truthful language. Nature was not just the focus of romantic disenchantment with the new urban existence of the late 18th and early 19th century, but also a mirror in which the Romantics could see the eternal powers which had created both man and the physical universe, revealing the possible meaning of existence, offering the ground on which the greatest struggle in Romantic thinking was fought, between subject, the person, and object, what the person was observing or experiencing, between the world and our experience of it, between the world outside us and the world within each of us. Poet John Keats developed a theory of negative capability, an imaginative openness to all aspects of human experience. For Keats, the intense beauty of the world of things is expressible only through poetry, the primary art form of the English Romantic movement. We've spoken of the social radicalism of the lyrical ballads. In the 200 years since their publication, there's been an increasing understanding by scholars of the significant role played by Wordsworth's sister Dorothy in helping him with his work, as well as her own accomplishments as a diarist, letter writer, poet, journalist, and publisher. Unlike Coleridge or her brother William, Dorothy was rarely painted during her lifetime. We see her here in old age, but also, interestingly, to the right, there is an incomplete image of Dorothy in the background of a sketch of the two published poets. Her semi-erasure seems highly symbolic. As a woman, she is seen as marginal to the achievements of her brother and her friend. However, one of the most remarkable features of the Romantic movement, and another way in which it continues to shape our own era, is that for the first time in literary history, so many of the writers were women. Jane Austen, who remains to this day one of England's most popular novelists, wrote during the Romantic period. Her novels were focused on love and emotional relationships. However, she would not have considered herself part of the movement. The irony and detachment of her novels, their waspish sense of satire, the lethal elegance of her writing style, perhaps owe more to the preceding neoclassical era. Although Northanger Abbey is a Gothic novel, it subverts and parodies the genre in a very effective way. Inarguably, the great Romantic novelists were the three sisters pictured here, Charlotte, Emily, and Anne, daughters of a vicar who lived on the edge of the highly romantic Gothic Yorkshire moors. Brought up in relative isolation, the Bronte sisters wrote some of the greatest novels ever published. In Jane Eyre, Charlotte Bronte presents an independent, educated woman who makes her own way in the world in the face of considerable social challenges. Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights creates the brooding anti-hero Heathcliff, whose passionate and often abusive relationship with the tough-minded but vulnerable Cathy in the dramatic setting of the moors created a template for romances for the next 2 centuries. Like Jane Austen, George Eliot is somewhat detached from the mainstream Romantic movement, but she was highly influenced by Romantic literature and philosophy, fascinated by the complex moral choices faced by her characters in a complex world, particularly one in which belief in God was increasingly problematic. Philosopher Mary Wollstonecraft, who we see in the centre of this picture, was writing about women's rights in her Vindication of the Rights of Women 6 years before the Lyrical Ballads. Her daughter, also Mary, married to the poet Percy Shelley, wrote possibly the most famous novel of the Romantic era, the Gothic classic Frankenstein. Fascinated by, but also fearful of, the results of human ambition and intellectual curiosity. A work that remains as relevant, maybe more so, in 2020 as it was in 1818. In her lifetime, Mary Shelley was much less celebrated than her husband, which is perhaps reflected in the differing quality of the portraits here. His work is less remembered today. He died young, drowning in a sailing accident in Italy, but during his short life and career as a poet, he wrote some of the most politically radical poetry ever published, offering a savage critique of the government of the time when it was still dangerous to do so. His work is a reminder that political ideology was a key aspect of the Romantic movement. After all, this was the age of Napoleon, who had brought political revolution across Europe and who was himself a romantic figure, a charismatic leader from humble background who'd achieved extraordinary power across Europe through his own brilliance and uncompromising will. However, in his ruthlessness, he was an object of fear as well as admiration, an anti-hero, or perhaps a Byronic hero. The Byronic hero was of course created by the poet Lord George Byron, immortally described by his former lover Lady Caroline Lamb as mad, bad and dangerous to know. He's been seen by many as the first celebrity, the object of extraordinary fascination in his lifetime, someone who played the role of romantic poet to perfection. Witty, romantic, brooding, glamorous, attractive and cruel. Like his friend Shelley, he was highly political, and he died in Greece en route to fighting for Greek independence. Like a true romantic, he lived his values with integrity. As Byron's death demonstrates, Romanticism helped inspire not only a fascination with individual autonomy, but also national autonomy and cultural identity. Many of the great Romantic writers of the 19th century across Europe were political radicals and revolutionaries, often leaders of independence movements. In Poland, poet Adam Mickiewicz was a leader of the revolution against the Russian Empire. In Italy, Giacomo Leopardi influenced the later independence movement against the Austrian Empire, while Almeida Garrett was one of Portugal's leading poets and radicals. In Scotland, Romanticism helped also shape a similar cultural revolution and a deepening sense of Scottish national identity through the novels of the conservative aristocrat Sir Walter Scott, we see at the bottom in the middle, and the poetry of working-class radical Robbie Burns. What made Burns even more radical was that he wrote in Scottish dialect, celebrating it as the authentic, natural language of his people and place. His greatest English counterpart was Northamptonshire poet John Clare, from a working-class background, who wrote, like Burns, in local dialect. He wrote some of the most beautiful poems ever written about the natural world. Tragically, John Clare became a victim of the social changes wrought by the Industrial Revolution. As the landscape he had known all his life was destroyed, he lost his own sense of identity and rootedness, and he ended his years in a psychiatric hospital. Depression and madness were common themes in Gothic and Romantic literature, fascinated as it was with the fragility of human identity, the power of the irrational within the human psyche. Seen right here is an iconic painting of Thomas Chatterton, a poet who predated the Romantic era. He died in 1770. What made him such a source of fascination for the Romantics was the combination of his self-destructiveness, he committed suicide, and his youth, just 17 when he died. This preoccupation with youth was very much part of Romanticism, particularly its prioritization of innocence, feeling, and idealism over experience, reason, and worldliness. Another example was John Keats, who, like Burns, Clare, and Chatterton, came from a working-class background. And like Chatterton, he died young, aged 25, after a lifetime, in his case, of ill health. Mainly neglected in his lifetime, partly due to class snobbery about his origins, Keats is now seen as one of the greatest of English poets. His poems from Autumn to Ode to a Nightingale are among the most popular in the language 200 years later. His poetry is characterized by its intensity of observation, the sensuousness and musicality of his language. Beauty is truth, truth beauty. That is all ye know on earth and all ye need to know. Another London writer from working-class background, like Keats, mainly neglected in his lifetime, was William Blake. Painter and poet, wholly self-educated, Blake is one of the most fascinating artists in English history, a genuine visionary, a political and religious radical. His great illustrated work, Songs of Innocence and Experience, presents childhood innocence in contrast with a fallen adult world of corruption and cynicism. In his preoccupation with the authenticity and creativity of childhood, Blake was representative of Romanticism. Like the mountains and forests, children were natural and unspoilt, sources of expressive truth, uncorrupted by civilization. This again represented a radical change from earlier eras when children were treated as adults from a young age, forced into early employment, mercilessly punished for the most minor crimes, exploited and often brutalized. Blake's poetry and art speak angrily against the exploitation of the young, old, poor and vulnerable by the powerful and privileged. Another working-class Londoner, Joseph Mallard Turner, was probably the greatest romantic artist of the age. Extraordinarily expressive and inventive, going beyond the representational towards the abstract in his expression of emotion through landscape. The art critic, John Ruskin, argued that he truthfully measures the moods of nature, seeking an emotional truth beyond the visual, his use of light creating a sense of transcendence beyond the form. Music has perhaps an even greater power than art to transcend form, to convey emotional intensity. The archetypal romantic composer was Ludwig van Beethoven, whose music conveyed an unprecedented emotive power and force. As with many romantic artists, part of the power of Beethoven's work came from its perceived authenticity, the struggle it conveyed mirroring the turbulence of his own life. In this painting, his hair is presented as appropriately wild and untamed, mirroring his musical style. In the centre of this slide, you can see a lock of his hair, which extraordinarily sold for £35,000 at an auction last year. Hungarian composer Franz Liszt, pictured on the right, has hair equally untamed. Indeed, in his time, he was mobbed by passionate fans of his concerts, praised for his impassioned and uninhibited performances, but also mocked by more conservative concertgoers for his extravagant facial expressions and gestures during recitals. Just as Turner's paintings anticipated the later Impressionists by half a century, Liszt's style of music anticipated that of Debussy and Ravel by many decades. If any year could be cited as the end of the Romantic era, it would be 1848, the year of political protest and revolution across Europe, inspired by Romantic belief in political equality, individual rights, and democracy. From Belgium to Denmark, from Germany to Hungary, there was a sense of idealism and of possibility. Even in England, there were mass protests in London, as you can see from the photograph in the centre, from the Chartist movement seeking political reform and the expansion of the vote to working people. However, as the cartoon at the bottom right reveals, each rebellion in turn was crushed, and the ensuing disillusion and demoralisation did much to bring the Romantic era to a close. Not entirely, however. Following the reactionary backlash in Europe, many radicals and idealists fled across the Atlantic to the Republic of the United States of America, symbol of freedom and democracy they had failed to attain in Europe. They brought with them not only their political ideals, but their romantic cultural values. The American landscape lent itself to the aesthetic of the sublime, the sense of romantic possibility. The mid-19th century was the period of migration west into the prairies and beyond, the era of manifest destiny, as presented in this painting of the Oregon Trail by the German-born Albert Bierstadt. It's full of wide-eyed wonder as the pioneers head towards the promised land, a romantic landscape. The great American Romantic poet was Walt Whitman. Taking Wordsworth's and Coleridge's pledge to use natural language and forms further, he invented a conversational, loosened style of free verse to embody the democratic variety of America. His masterwork, Leaves of Grass, was constantly revised throughout his life, a celebration of the land and its people during the decades of pioneers in settlement. His romantic mission was continued into the 20th century by poets such as Allen Ginsberg, and indeed it can be argued that Romanticism remains an unfinished chapter in American literature, with the protean American dream still at the heart of the country's sense of itself. In Europe, in contrast, Romanticism became an aesthetic of retreat, following the dissolution of 1848. In England, Romanticism continued in the Victorian era, most notably in the work of Alfred Tennyson and in the paintings of the pre-Raphaelite movement, often taking the form of medieval spirituality in which Romanticism could trace its roots back to the 12th century. However, many saw this as a form of escapism in the face of the ugly ubiquity of industrialization and the brute reality of empire. In his poem, The Lady of Shalott, the protagonist, pictured here in John William Waterhouse's pre-Raphaelite painting, is trapped in a tower, gazing into a mirror as she weaves her tapestry, unable to look at the real world outside her window. Tennyson seems to acknowledge the seductive, narcissistic dangers of such romanticism. It is notable that Tennyson's contemporary, Charles Dickens, although his work includes features of romanticism, particularly in its presentation of emotion and its focus on the poor and marginalised, is interested not in the natural world, not in medieval fantasy, but the industrial reality that by the 1840s was reality for most British people. And indeed, in the second half of the 19th century, the realist and naturalist schools of writing and art, buttressed by the new technology of photography, were creating what they saw as a more scientific, more objective, more truthful art form, designed to engage with the complex world of urbanization, industrialization, and technological revolution. It was a Darwinian world of physical struggle and material survival, not seeking transcendental truths on mountaintops. Darwinian, of course, owes its etymology to Charles Darwin, whose Origin of Species, published in 1860, had a profound influence not only on science, but also on religion, politics, art, and literature. Darwin's work had a particular effect on the novelist and essayist George Eliot, whose work represents a fascinating bridge from Romanticism to realism. Adapting Keats' famous line, she argued, "The doctrine that all truth and beauty are to be attained by a humble and faithful study of nature." Of course, just as Romanticism had retained elements of the rationalism it had reacted against, so realism and naturalism had elements of the Romanticism they eclipsed. But Romanticism has never really gone away. In many ways, we still live in the Romantic era. Nature represents both a small c conservative impulse to get away to the country in search of something healthy and authentic, but also radical revolutionary impulse in Extinction Rebellion to save a planet under pressure, a belief in people power. Marginalised groups continue to seek equal rights, whether based on gender, ethnicity, social class, or all three. Across the globe, we see the rise of nationalism once more, including the USA and the UK. Among some, there is a suspicion of reason, of science, and even of facts. We don't live in an age of industrial revolution, but we do live in a technological one, equally unsettling, and also through AI, bringing important philosophical questions about the nature of individual identity that are deeply romantic. Meanwhile, our understanding and appreciation of the complexity of our minds and the needs for mental health are another legacy from the Romantic era. Romance, of course, remains at the heart of our culture in the books, movies, and songs that most of us choose to read, watch, and listen. We still encourage creativity, self-expression, individuality in our children, another romantic legacy. But of course, we still worry about selfishness, narcissism, and a lack of social responsibility, just as critics of Romanticism did in the early 1800s. Thus, whether we like it or not, we are still living in the Romantic era, and writers and artists from Wordsworth to Beethoven, Bronte to Turner, Burns to Eliot still have much to teach us as we try to understand our own world as well as that of our forebears.